Welcome to the Building Web3 Podcast. Today, my good friend Mert. He is the co-founder of Helius. But Mert, before we get too deep into Helius, give us a brief background into yourself and how you got into the world of crypto.
Sure. Thanks for having me. I got into crypto in school. So I was doing physics work back in the day, and then I worked at BlackBerry. So I wanted to go into theoretical physics. I worked at BlackBerry for a year as an intern, which then led me into the more pragmatic side of software, let's say, as opposed to theory. And so while I was changing my courses, I took a cryptography course, and specifically the applications of cryptography. And obviously, blockchains were one of them. Although pretty early at the time, I don't think Ethereum really did much or had much live at that point. Bitcoin was live. And that's when I first got into it. And so I've always kept it in my brain on some level. And then I worked at a few large banks in Canada, building software, investment infrastructure, payment systems. Did the same thing for a few startups and basically said, well, these systems all suck. They're too inefficient. I hate them. And started working at Coinbase before they went public, slightly before they went public. And that was really the big leap into crypto. And yeah, that's got to meet a lot of cool, like-minded folks at Coinbase and been a reply guying since.
You know, for people that are unfamiliar with Mert, it would probably be pretty hard if you're in this crypto scene, but Mert is prolific on the timeline. But one thing I want to ask about is, so we've interviewed, and I would almost call it how there's a PayPal mafia. There almost seems to be a group of people that came out of Coinbase, and I would also group Consensus in there that went on to just start a ton of different companies. But what made you end up choosing to go with Solana? I feel like a lot of people ended up going into the Ethereum ecosystem. What made you take the leap into the Solana land?
Well, I was already working on Ethereum things in my day job at Coinbase. So Ethereum, Optimism, Polygon, and actually even Avalanche. But I figured this is still quite early, so it makes sense to do research into other protocols and what they have to offer. And Solana was designed, or I read all the white papers, but in Solana's design really made quite a bit of sense to me in the way that I approached scaling. Ethereum's was very conditional on a lot of different things going live in the future, versus Solana already scaled, but now you had to fix software issues and then basically use physics. That seemed, but at the time that was for some reason almost a sinful view when everybody was saying, oh, monolithic chains are bad, etc. By the way, they're not called monolithic chains. But so I started building on Solana on my own time just for fun. Started minting some NFTs, playing around. And there was basically no data sites, no analytics sites, no explorers. And I would build some of the things myself on the weekend or something. And that was fun. And when I would post about them, then the community would really flock to it. And I would get users and friends. And at one point, if people remember the NFT craze, and there used to be NFT sales bots all the time, and people would comment free whenever an NFT was sold for $1 billion. I was basically building all those bots for Solana at one point. And it was just much more fun. And it didn't feel like I was building on quicksand because the protocol had a very clear North Star and a vision and a certain way of doing things. But there was a lot of problems within the development sphere, but they were solvable problems. And so I figured, okay, what better to do and maximize impact than actually build on a chain that scales but fix the solvable problems that are solvable through just hard work and iteration. Versus on Ethereum, I would have felt that my own fate is not in my own hands because there's a lot of different alignment games and politics that were being played at the time, whereas on Solana, I could just go ship, and that's what we've done.
But first, let's talk about our amazing sponsor, HiMapper, who helps make this show possible. They're keeping maps up to date in a really clever way. All you need to do is drive your normal routes with their smart dash cam installed. No extra routes, no extra hassle, just drive like you always do and get rewarded. Join HiMapper and keep the map fresh for everyone. Yeah, it's quite interesting that you talk about like the early days of building on Solana and having a really fun experience. Many people have joked about like the chewing glass. Like, so you found the experience of building on Solana relatively easy at first, or you found it to be quite different than Ethereum? Talk to us a little bit about like your early days and kind of how it's progressed from like a developer standpoint.
Well, when I first started building on it, there were no docs, and so that was hard. And the docs that did exist sucked, and one of the things was Chase at the time, who was the head of DevRel, would say things like, well, there's no docs, so you can really make an impact by being able to figure some of this stuff out. And it was actually correct.
That's beautiful reframing, by the way.
Yeah. And so at first, the experience definitely sucked, and I would say it was worse than Ethereum. Now, as you learn the programming model, you might actually like it better. So I ended up liking it better. It really depends on what kind of programmer you are. That being said, a lot of the things about it still sucked, and actually probably still suck today, which is why we built Helius, because the entire purpose of Helius is to fix the developer experience in crypto. And the highest leverage place we can do that, in my view, is Solana.
Yeah, let's talk about maybe some of the parts that like make it difficult. Is it, hey, people may come from like a C++ background, or maybe they come from like a TypeScript background. They're like, okay, Rust is confusing, or is like the account model. Like, what are the things you feel like you identify and you're like, this needs to be fixed, thus I will create Helius?
Yeah, there's quite a few. But the first one that I was annoyed by was human readability of on-chain data. Because if you think about it, we tout blockchains as being these transparent things where everybody can see what's happening. But transparency doesn't mean shit if nobody can actually read it, right? If somebody's talking to me in Chinese and they're like, well, I'm telling you everything transparently, but I don't speak Chinese, that doesn't mean much to me. And so there's a lot of reasons for that, which are pretty complex, so I won't get into them. But at first, we just wanted to parse the chain and then expose the parsed data to developers and applications. While doing that, we noticed a lot of other issues, specifically on the read layer, so RPCs and indexing and APIs. And while doing that, other things started breaking. For example, Solana sending transactions broke for a little bit during the pump.fun and ore mining congestion episodes. And so now we had to build better transaction centers for Solana and also spin up a validator, because that's how you're able to prioritize your transactions. It's correlated to stake. And as you keep doing that, you keep finding other problems that you think should be fixed. Another one is, for example, creating token accounts on Solana is relatively expensive if you do them at mass. So if you want to create 10,000 accounts for an airdrop, that's expensive. And so we helped build compression to reduce those costs by 5,000, 6,000x. And so there's really not, and by the way, everything you also said also goes. And so, for example, yeah, writing Rust is probably more intimidating than writing Solidity, although it's also more fun in my view and gives you more leverage as a developer. The account model is not as intuitive as coupling all that together, storage and logic on one contract. That being said, some types of programmers find that more intuitive. It really depends on their background.
Yeah, and so talk to us a little bit about like, scaling Solana. So we've had people on here like the Eclipse team who are like, hey, they essentially created an L2 and then used Solana for, I think it was the transactions. And then we've had other teams like Termina that are talking a lot about like Solana network extensions. If you look at like Ethereum, they ended up just splitting out into different L2s. What do you think do you think the future is just making Solana as fast as possible, or is it like app chains? Where do you think the future kind of lies in terms of Solana scalability?
Yeah, I mean, there's a very simple answer to this. I wrote about it on SolanaRoadmap.com, and it is increased bandwidth, reduced latency. Nothing else to it. And what we mean by that, and one of the things that people very often get wrong, and especially if you had Eclipse and Termina, some folks might be familiar with this. The big difference between SVM and Solana versus Ethereum and EVM and L2s and all that, there's one difference. The L1 itself does not cater to these network extensions. Whereas on Ethereum, the roadmap entirely changes to cater to them, right? So Solana is much more like Bitcoin, where, yeah, you can fork Bitcoin and add a dog coin on it, or you can put L2s on top of Bitcoin. But the core protocol itself only really has one goal. In Bitcoin, it's store value or digital gold, whatever you want to call it. On Solana, it's increasing bandwidth, reducing latency. And what that means is syncing information as fast as physics allows around the globe at once. Now, if due to that design, the block space is valuable enough such that L2s want to extend it, or if they like how the SVM is architected and say they want to carry it forward to another ecosystem, totally fine. But the difference is the L1 core devs do not care about those. They don't tailor to it. They don't add blobs to the roadmap so that the L2s can post on it cheaply. They just care about how to make this faster.
Yeah, and I think that makes a lot of sense. I'm quite interested in what you kind of attribute Solana's, continued growth to be. It seemed like after FTX, like it was a very difficult time for the entire chain, and then maybe like Deepin decided to continue to build on Solana. Like, how have they really survived? Is it just this like core mission of like, hey, let's build a very like fast performant chain that doesn't fragment liquidity everywhere?
It really depends on who we're talking about because the community is not homogenous. There's a bunch of different types of people. Sure. For developers, and back in the day, we came up with this thing called Only Possible on Solana, which is kind of the slogan where you build things only possible here because nothing else scales today. So at that time, that was definitely a big factor. I don't think that's quite a factor anymore. I think multiple chains are scalable at this point. Or so they say so on their white paper, but we'll see. And so without that, what then remains? Well, there's also a pretty big focus on being pragmatic, and there's a culture of execution where something that threw off a lot of people based on my chats is this sort of moral posturing and almost religious high priestry where you shun certain people for building certain ways and whatnot. Whereas on Solana, it's like, what do we care about? We care about fat. And by fat, we mean founders, apps, tokens. We're going to be as founder-friendly as possible. We want to focus on apps so apps can build products instead of worrying about white papers of hypothetical scaling things. And then tokens because, again, this is NASDAQ or decentralized NASDAQ. And blockchains fundamentally are asset ledgers. And what you want to do is you want to enable the trading or any operation, transferring, burning, whatever, taking leverage, borrowing, lending, those assets in one giant state machine. And the reason is because less fragmentation, better price discovery, better execution, but then also better composability. So if I'm a protocol or if I'm a token launching on Pump, I launch on Pump, but that actually uses Radium, which then ties into some Telegram bots, which then ties into borrow lend markets. And so it's this global ecosystem, like a composable economy. So that would be, and then there's a lot of things that actually probably aren't talked about so much. Things like Super Team, which is a global community of Solana builders all around the globe. And Toli, Toli is a great founder, top two really, along with Vitalik. And so people also kind of seeing him advocate for his ideas and saying, yeah, I actually agree with those ideas as well. So perhaps I'll build here. I think all kind of combined to play a big role.
Yeah, there's a few things you mentioned there. One is like the super team. So for people that are unfamiliar, and you can add more context, I'm limited, but it was essentially a team that went to India, different regions, and tried to set up resourcing for developers and try to like give out grants, things of that nature. Maybe you could fill in some gaps there, but that's my general understanding of the super team.
So I think that's how it started, but it's actually global now, meaning there's super teams all around per region. So there's a super team Canada, there's a super team UAE, super team Poland, UK, Singapore, all these different ones. And basically, yeah, it's decentralized communities around the globe that generally are quite startup focused. So host a lot of hackathons, startup competitions, but also are a space for people like-minded in those areas to, get to know each other, hang out, and then contribute to Solana via whatever way. Sometimes it might be, art. We actually did one where it was a writing hackathon where it was just writing content. So I think each of them can kind of have different missions within their own right, but globally speaking, it's just how you evangelize those local communities to build on chain and on Solana.
Yeah, I remember speaking with an executive at Vail that was quite close with the super team, and they were talking about like their main goal was like to know most of the community members. So it was to go into like a new region and really establish a person there that they like knew really well. And like a lot of people will, talk about like, hey, we've got like 10,000 people in our community, but it's like, all right, do they actually care? Are they just like airdrop hunters? One thing I think that Solana has done really incredibly well is obviously, one, the tech is great, and two, it's like the focus on culture. I don't know what you specifically attribute that to. Is it, totally, is it the vision from the foundation? Is it the support for builders, or like things like the super team? Or why do you think they've been so successful from like a cultural perspective and really capturing the zeitgeist?
Well, certainly it had to have started from top down, and the core Solana team, which includes both Anza and Labs, meaning Toli and Raj, but also Foundation, meaning Lily and Dan and Super Team as well. Everybody basically had that same mentality, which is, well, first focus on shipping. It doesn't matter what you say on your paper. What matters is what you ship to production. In fact, the technical co-founder of Solana, Greg, I listened to a podcast that he did years ago, and he said the line, basically, Ethereum is more like science and Solana is more like engineering. And anybody who's went to school or even just read about science knows what that dichotomy is, which is one is very academic and maybe sometimes overly theoretical. That's not to say it has no benefits. But then one is very pragmatic, like we're going to get our hands dirty and ship shit to prod and see if it works. If it doesn't, we'll iterate. And that actually got Solana into a lot of trouble early on, by the way, right? A lot of outages and whatnot. But it's something that everybody embodies. So Toli, he still posts on Twitter every day. If you see his tweets, he still communicates those values very clearly. And those are the values that he has, right? From being an engineer for 20, 30 years and rest of the Solana core team. And then so as a builder, for example, that's how I'm oriented. And so I see that and I'm like, okay, I'm also going to join that. And so now I'm propagating those values. But then people who listen to me maybe now join Solana, and then now they propagate those values. So, and then over time that decentralizes, and then perhaps that doesn't stay the case forever. But I think this is the one place in crypto today where you really, if you think shipping, if you think execution, I think Solana is kind of, at least culturally, the logical choice to pick.
Yeah, and I can even tie this back to a Web2 aspect. So historically, if you had looked at like the two different cultures from like a place like when I worked at Google, I never worked at Facebook, but I know many people that were there, is like Facebook was very like just ship shit. And it was just like get things out the door. And yeah, again, that like can get you in trouble, but it gets for really good velocity. And then Google's was a very like academic approach. It was almost like you were dang near writing like a research paper or getting a ton of sign off. And it kind of draws back a lot to, in my opinion, the founders themselves. Like the two founders of Google were, I think, PhD dropouts. So they had a much more academic, where I think Mark, dropped out of Facebook or dropped out of Harvard his freshman year. So like a much more like move fast and break things. So a lot of what you've been mentioning is kind of this like top down direction from like somebody like Toli, somebody like yourself. What do you feel like is the importance of, like, it's a buzzword, but like founder led marketing and really like being out on the timeline and kind of like leading from Twitter and leading with your values?
Oh, it's very important. It's probably the most underrated thing, especially in the last, let's say, 6-7 years in tech. I do think that's now changing, especially with Trump and all the Elons of the world and Balajis of the world being more loud on the internet. But fundamentally, it comes down to the concept of, if you don't tell your story, somebody else will, and you don't want that. right? You don't want these random journalists who perhaps don't understand your protocol and generally have biased agendas to tell your story. You want to be in a position where you can say what you're building in your own authentic self and advocate for it, right? It's not always pretty either. You can say something like, well, we're solving this problem, and then somebody will reply, well, that problem doesn't exist, or you're solving it wrong, and all this. And that's when you really see the true self of the founder, is how they engage with that. Are they articulate? Can they actually hold debate? How much do they actually believe in this? All this. And so it's very important. And especially, right, back in the day, attention was abundant, but distribution was scarce. And so you would get the New York Times of the world, who have distribution, getting all the attention. And the big businessmen and whatnot wouldn't really have a platform other than if, CNBC gave it to them. Now it's the opposite, where attention is scarce, but distribution is abundant, where everybody can distribute anything they want, but to get attention is difficult because there's a lot of other people doing it. And so how do you stand out in that world? Well, you probably can't just be another corporate account, because most corporate accounts are very similar. They say similar things. They have a very well understood risk profile in general. But as a founder, you're a person, you're a human. And, if you accept the premise that all humans are somewhat unique and have their own style and thoughts and values and all this, if you just communicate that authentically, well, then you'll find people who gravitate to that. And ideally, that's also in line with the company that you're building, right? So if you're a libertarian and if you think capitalism should evolve and you're about high performance, it would make sense for me that I also build a high performance infrastructure company so that people can build on these rails. It wouldn't make sense, for example, if I was doing something that's, I don't know, I'm not going to make up some example to offend everybody, but, it has to be somewhat in line with that. And that's, and especially in a world where the reason I bring up the last 4 or 5 years is because it's just full of so many lies and deception and fake news, people call it. It's much better. Like, the people just have lost trust, right? Nobody actually has trust anymore, which is probably a good thing. They should be more critical. And so why rely on somebody else's interpretation of what somebody else said instead of just going to the source and just interacting with that person?
Yeah, so it seems like there's a few things. It's one, it's like, hey, the source of truth. Like, if you're always on the timeline, you are the source of truth, because you're constantly. People can't misquote you. You literally have it right there. I mean, I guess people could Photoshop. And then two, it seems like people connect with people, not necessarily brands. So are you kind of bearish on brand marketing? I'm sure, Helius is still actively pumping out brand content. What's your general perspective on, let's say we've got a future founder or maybe somebody taking a crack at their second or third startup? What should they focus on for their new company? Should it be hey, I got to be on the timeline, super visible, and just espousing my values?
Well, I'm certainly not bearish brand marketing. I think brand marketing is very useful, and if you do it right, it can be very strong. And ideally, my point is that ideally it's integrated with the founder somewhat, right? The brand can't be totally separate from the founder,
I see.
right? If you think of Tesla, but then you don't think of Elon Musk at all, I don't think that it really exists. In fact, people maybe sometimes will protest Tesla just because of Elon Musk. That's the other side of it, but that's kind of how it goes. And so if I were a new founder, and what would I do? Which sides would I focus on? And the reason this is a heated topic is because it's not a cookie cutter answer. There's no general answer, because it depends entirely on your business. For example, if you're selling CRM software to Fortune 500 companies, talking a lot of shit on Twitter is probably not going to do much for you. Yeah. On the other hand, if you're posting on LinkedIn, or if you're doing a lot of Zoom calls and you're really going to these conferences and you're doing hand-to-hand combat sales, that will help you much more. And so people often conflate founder-led marketing with posting on Twitter. That's just one channel for founder-led marketing. It's not the only one. You can do it. Some people can just do it based on video alone. Some people can do it via conferences alone. Some people can do it via not being public at all. So, for example, Bridge got acquired by Stripe for $1.1 billion. Neither of those founders posted on Twitter really much at all. But you can bet that they were good at enterprise sales and selling to people on a Zoom call, or doing the good old sales cycle in person. So what I would say is identify who your target market is very well and very concisely, right? Crypto people make this mistake of thinking that their market is a set of all people who want to make money, and that's not a market because that's everybody, right? You didn't actually segment anything. Nobody wants to lose money. And so it's like, okay, is it people who want to make money because they are a sovereign fund and they have certain regulatory requirements, and that already starts narrowing down how you do outreach. Or is it developers, right? Is it researchers? Is it, it could be any different combination of customer personas, but you need to identify those. And then, by the way, I used to post on Twitter before I was a founder, right? I was already doing that. And so while, after finding a company, just keeping doing that wasn't too much of a lift. But I would certainly say, the one thing I'll say is, in terms of advice, is do not outsource this. Like, somebody on the co-founding team needs to know how to do this, or needs to be interested in doing this and spend at least half their time on it, right? This isn't even unconventional advice. Paul Graham will tell you this, where you either talk to customers or you sell, right? Or no, you build product or you talk to customers. And talking to customers is very important. Now, you can talk to them on Twitter or you can talk to them one-on-one. That's up to you, but you can't neglect that part.
Yeah, so it seems like a few things. It's like, one, identify who your audience is, and then it's like pick the channel. Like, is it enterprise sales? In which case, like, hey, we're going to be posting a lot on LinkedIn, and then it's, hey, if you're going to be founding a company, you need to at least have one of the co-founders be a marketing person. One person maybe more focused on the product, and another.
I would say salesperson as opposed to marketing.
That makes more sense. So one thing is, and we can loop back into talking more about Solana. Like, Solana has really exploded in this past year in a positive way, like in terms of interest. We have like the Trump coin being released on Solana. What are some exciting things that you see on like Solana's roadmap, or see for Solana? Is it like a token emission schedule? Like, what are you really excited about coming out for Solana?
Sure. Well, yeah, so token emission schedule, there's a proposal for reducing that right now, or making it market-based instead of time-based. But really the thing that excites me the most is we're handling all this traffic, all this volume, and all this attention while being pretty broken. And people don't really see that as broken because it still works quite well and it still does more TPS than any other chain today. But it does that while being broken. And what I mean by that is the software that the nodes run on a blockchain network, right, the clients, very inefficient. In fact, Solana lead dev Alessandro posted that roughly 93% of that capacity is unused, right? That's it. Just if you just write the code differently, and obviously easier said than done, you can already get 90% improvements in utilization and scalability. But that's just that. There's also a second client in Fireinster coming, which is a different language, rewritten from the bottom up of performance, and helpful for security because now you have two implementations. You have things like being able to double block space and perhaps 10x it over time, and obviously bigger blocks and more transactions. You have things like 00, which is a new fiber network where it's really a faster internet, and so better network speeds and better information propagation around the globe. You have things like multiple concurrent proposers, right? Currently, the way a blockchain works is there's one node that produces a block and then it goes to everybody else. But what if there were actually multiple concurrent people proposing blocks at the same time? That could be interesting and pretty good for scalability. There is separating out execution from consensus. So that's quite a bit boring, but that's also a big performance improvement. And better fee markets. So there's a lot there in terms of just tech alone. And I think the question will be, or where I would like Solana to be in 5 years, whatever. It's like, well, okay, if you think of building a startup today, what do you think of? Well, you probably think of Silicon Valley or Y Combinator or SF, right? That's in very close location to your next steps. If you want to build traditional finance and get involved with the big banks, what do? Well, you probably go to Wall Street. And so what I would like Solana to become is in 3-5 years, when you build an application, when you want to build an application in crypto, you think of Solana because it's the most founder friendly and it's where you can actually focus on product without worrying about scalability.
So is that the main pitch for, like, let's say there's a new founder in the audience and they're like, you know what, I'm still deciding on where to build my chain and they're like, maybe they're looking at Base, maybe they're looking at Solana, maybe they're looking at some other chain. Like, is that the main thing, being like, hey, Solana is founder friendly, it's fast, you can actually build here without having like scalability issues?
Yeah, I think the pitch is quite simply, we're the most founder friendly. And by most founder friendly, we mean, again, the fat thesis, founders, apps, tokens. So your app, you can actually focus on your app and your business logic without worrying about weird scalability roadmap items. You are on the decentralized NASDAQ, meaning if you have tokens involved, you get very good liquidity because it's a global state machine, but also a lot of composability with existing DeFi applications due to Solana's synchronous composability and atomic composability. But also you get a very hungry, I would say, community where it's come back, obviously, from FTX, but also several outages, and founders that are still very much involved, like Anatoly, and other founders within the ecosystem, like myself, like Lucas from Jito, Phantom, Jupiter, right? All these different guys have built relatively successful companies in crypto, and they're basically all there to help you succeed as well. And also, it's decentralized, meaning you don't need our permission. You can just do things.
Yeah, I think it's a great thing. And I'm quite curious, like I come from like working with deep in companies and, you know, DeFi companies. What are some of the like use cases that you see being really popular in, you know, the next like 2 to 3 years? Or like, what do you feel like? Because some people will sometimes critique like blockchain people and they're like, hey, blockchain is a solution in search of a problem. What kind of like problems do you think that, you know, Solana and other blockchain companies will be solving? Are you bullish on like SocialFi or DeepIn or any different kinds of spaces?
Well, the obvious answer is that since we will have better regulation now, the use cases that make the most sense and have made the most sense for a while will be the ones that benefit the most immediately. And so stablecoins, RWAs, and payments, right? Those, everybody just thinks of them as boring because they don't necessarily make the price go up very fast, but they are a better way of doing finance in many cases. Probably not all cases, but stablecoins are just inherently better for international commerce and merchants as well, right? And with RWAs, I'm not an expert on that one, but it makes sense that some of these things should be more liquid, more accessible, and markets obviously benefit from more liquidity because that obviously means there's more information going into them, meaning they're a bit more efficient, and there's more opportunity and equality of opportunity, more importantly, for other people who didn't have access to them before. And so the thing with regulation in the past that people, I think, have misunderstood is they'll say something like, well, blockchain does not solve any problems because it's all speculation right now. Well, actually, the lack of good regulation makes it such that speculative use cases are the ones that benefit because those guys are going to do what they want regardless. They don't actually care about your weird rules that are relatively arbitrary and actually local to a jurisdiction, right? People in Asia will do whatever. They don't care about the legislation in the USA. And so the people that it actually harms are people who want to do non-speculative things like just payments rails. And they can't do it because now they're scared that Gensler will come after them. But that's not the case anymore. And so I would expect those guys, and that's why you're seeing so much activity in M&A for stablecoins, to start becoming much more prevalent. And that also probably does translate into DeepIn because DeepIn somewhat combines all of those, right? I wouldn't say it's quite an RWA, but it's its own thing, so I'm not going to analogize it. But it's like the best illustration of international payment rails where somebody in Europe can be mapping something, somebody in Middle East can be mapping something, somebody in the USA can be mapping something, and they can all contribute to this protocol. And they get paid within crypto without having to go through all these different rails. And I believe I had Ariel on my podcast from HighMapper, and he talked about how they actually tried doing HiveMapper without crypto rails at first, right? It was just cash and sending money that way. And it just wasn't as good for their business as crypto was, because not only are the payments more efficient, there's also a different incentive structure now, right? And so I would expect to see more cases like that.
Yeah, I would also say like these incentive structures, and we could pivot away from the deep end. Maybe if we even have some normie listeners all the way up to this point. When I remember interviewing Bo from Polymer, he's like, you could make a dating app that essentially just balances like the economies via like token transfers. So like bootstrapping networks with tokenomics is quite an interesting thing, and quite like it's obviously native to crypto itself. But I know you've been very generous with your time. So finally, like, what milestones can people expect from Helius? We've already gone over some of the Solana stuff, but what things can people look forward to from you guys?
Well, one thing that's a big criticism of Solana currently is the developer experience, and specifically the read layer developer experience, which means reading data and being able to understand that data or query it or store it. And I'm pretty confident we'll be fixing that in 6 months maximum. We have 3 big products lined up to help those issues be resolved. And our actual goal is, or mission statement internally at least, is to increase the economic potential of the world's developers. And what we mean by that is, now as a developer, for the first time ever, probably in history, actually definitely in history, you can be from anywhere in the world. You can be a kid in Bangladesh that's 16 years old, and you can write a few lines of code and basically architect an economy. And you can be on the same rails and playing around as giants from Chicago. And so now what matters is the merits of what you built, and equality of opportunity at least, has been increased. It's not perfect yet still. And now the best ideas can win. And as a result, I think that's how capitalism evolves to its next stage. And so that's maybe a 10-year mission for Helius, but immediately what we want to do is make it super easy for developers to have an idea and have that idea into something tangible that they can play with as soon as possible without worrying about anything else.
Absolutely. Well, finally, where can people learn more about you and go follow you online?
I really just post on Twitter, so x.com/0xmert, MERT_.
Perfect. And we'll put all the links in the description to Helius and to your Twitter. Thank you so much for coming on the Building Web3 podcast. Let's continue building the future of on-chain.